After that catastrophic blowout at the Manhattan Gala, everyone turned on me. Every single billionaire socialite and corporate shark in the room stared with cold, unblinking judgment. But the sharpest blade didn't come from the press or the upper crust crowd. It came from my own husband. Kneel down and apologize to my mother. Garrison snapped his voice, a lethal, low hiss that cut through the elite chatter. Or you can walk out of this family with nothing but the clothes on your back. So I chose nothing. I didn't pack for a cheap hotel in Brooklyn, and I didn't run crying to a friend's couch in Queens. I opened my laptop, drained my hard-earned personal savings, and bought 2 one-way business-class tickets straight to London for me and my 4-year-old son, Oliver. By the time the high society tabloids realized we had completely fled the United States, it was already too late. And the almighty Vance family went utterly pale when I finally picked up the phone and told them exactly who was standing right beside me. I used to believe there was a grand, distinct line between being tolerated and being accepted. Then I married Garrison Vance and spent 8 exhausting years learning that in the world of the Manhattan ultra-wealthy, that line doesn't exist. Sometimes you are just a well-behaved ghost in their mansion. My name is Madelyn Thorne. Until very recently, I lived in a sprawling, pristine penthouse overlooking Central Park. To the outside world, I was living the ultimate American dream. I worked remotely as a senior data analyst for a cutting-edge biotech firm, quietly raising our son Oliver, and burning through a monumental amount of emotional energy trying to convince myself that my husband's family would eventually see me as one of their own. They never did. To them, I was always just the middle-class girl from Oregon who accidentally tripped and fell into the upper echelon of Wall Street. I still vividly remember the first time I met Garrison's mother, Eleanor Vance. She was the undisputed queen of the Upper East Side, a woman whose smile was as flawless as her $200,000 diamond necklace. She hugged me warmly, inhaled the scent of my modest perfume, and told me how absolutely lovely I was. The second time I met her, however, the mask slipped. We were sitting at an exclusive brunch spot in the Hamptons when she casually asked where I had gone to college. When I told her I had attended the University of Oregon on a hard-fought academic scholarship while working 20 hours a week to afford my textbooks, her pristine smile froze. It was an incredibly subtle shift, the kind only a woman of lesser status would catch. "Oh," Eleanor murmured, her eyes dropping to my off-the-rack dress. "How functional." From that fateful day forward, everything about me was deemed functional. My choice of clothes was functional. My corporate tech career was functional. My Pacific Northwest upbringing was functional. My family back home was functional. Eleanor never insulted me directly. She was far too intelligent and media-trained for such clumsy tactics. Instead, she mastered the psychological art of making me feel microscopic while sounding perfectly polite. At our mandatory Sunday dinners, she would seamlessly pivot the conversation to compare me to the wives of Garrison's hedge fund cousins. Julian's new wife just completed her double masters at Yale. Eleanor would chime swirling her vintage wine, and Victoria just secured a seat on the board of the Metropolitan Museum. The Sterling family comes from such historical pedigree. Then she would fix her icy blue eyes on me and offer a patronizing pat on my hand. But our Madelyn is just so grounded, it's refreshing, really. Everyone at the mahogany table would chuckle politely, including Garrison. Not because he genuinely agreed with his mother's malice, or so he always claimed afterward, but because he lived in absolute terror of making things awkward. That became Garrison's universal mantra for our entire marriage. "Don't make things awkward, Maddie. Don't start a fight. Don't take it personally. Don't ruin the evening." For 8 long years, I listened to him. For 8 years, I swallowed my pride plastered on a fake smile and played the part of the quiet, grateful wife. I pathologically convinced myself that keeping the peace for the sake of my family was worth the slow erosion of my soul. But then Oliver was born. Something fundamentally shifts in your DNA when you become a parent. You stop worrying exclusively about what powerful people think of you. Instead, you start panicking about what your child is actively absorbing from the environment around them. And Oliver was growing up in a house where his mother was treated like an unwelcome piece of functional furniture. He was learning things I refused to let him inherit. The illusion finally shattered into a million jagged pieces on a crisp autumn evening. I was sitting at the kitchen island of our penthouse coding a massive data stream for my biotech firm, while Oliver played quietly with his building blocks on the rug. Garrison wasn't home yet. He was out networking with Streetwall's top elite. Oliver suddenly stopped playing, walked over to me, and tugged gently on the hem of my sweater. He looked up at me with big, innocent eyes and asked a question that made my blood run cold. "Mommy, why does Grandma Eleanor look at you like you don't belong in our house?" My fingers froze over the keyboard. I remember gripping the edge of the marble counter so hard my knuckles turned white, feeling a sickening drop in the pit of my stomach. Children notice everything. They see the micro-expressions, hear the subtle tones, and feel the coldness in a room. That night, I confronted Garrison the moment he stepped through the door, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. But his reaction hurt almost as much as the question itself. He loosened his silk tie, sighed heavily, and gave me a look of pure exhaustion. "You're projecting your own insecurities onto a 4-year-old Maddie," he muttered, walking right past me to pour a glass of scotch. "Oliver's just a kid. Not everything is a class warfare battle." That sentence echoed in my mind for weeks because I wasn't fighting a battle. I was desperately trying to survive one. And the war was about to escalate. The months leading up to the structural collapse of my marriage were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Eleanor didn't back down after Oliver's question. She intensified her campaign. She began questioning everything under the guise of maternal concern. She questioned my corporate work hours, implying that a mother who stared at data streams all day was neglecting her son. She questioned our private nanny's background. She even questioned our financial layout, dropping passive-aggressive hints at the dinner table that Garrison's bonus shouldn't be funding my little projects back in Oregon, referring to the small retirement fund I was helping my aging parents build. Whenever I pushed back in the privacy of our bedroom, Garrison didn't defend me. He turned his frustration entirely on me. It was like watching someone defend a Category 5 hurricane while screaming at the people who were getting soaked by the rain. "She's a Vance Maddie," he would groan, tossing his phone onto the mattress. "She built the foundation of this family's social standing. If she offers advice, you nod, you say thank you, and you move on. Stop turning every single conversation into an ideological standoff." The absolute final straw arrived during the high-stakes preparations for Harrison Vance's landmark celebration. Harrison Garrison's father was an institution in New York's financial district. He was the founding titan of Vance Nexus Wealth, a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, and he had spent over 4 decades meticulously engineering a public reputation as a brilliant visionary and a philanthropic pillars of Manhattan society. The family was planning an astronomical gala to celebrate both the 35th anniversary of the fund and Harrison's Honorary Lifetime Achievement Award. More than 300 high-profile investors, political figures, international clients, and elite journalists were scheduled to attend. It was the social event of the fiscal year. For 6 grueling weeks, Eleanor obsessed over every microscopic detail, treating the gala like a state dinner. One Tuesday evening, while I was trying to feed Oliver his dinner and answer a critical server crash email from my biotech firm, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was Eleanor. Madelyn, darling, her voice chimed through the speaker, dripping with synthetic sweetness. "I'm reviewing the final guest list and seating arrangements. I wanted to call and gently remind you to dress appropriately for Saturday. I've already sent a list of approved designers to your email." I stared at the half-eaten plate of chicken nuggets in front of my son, a sudden wave of heat rushing up my neck. "Appropriately? What exactly does that mean, Eleanor?" "Oh, don't be prickly, dear," she chuckled, that melodic, razor-sharp sound that always made my chest tighten. "It simply means that some people from more relaxed environments don't always grasp the strict visual standards expected at a faux wall event of this magnitude. We will have international media there. I just want to ensure my son's wife doesn't look like she's attending a regional tech conference." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the kitchen. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the penthouse. "Are you talking about my background, Eleanor?" A calculated pause stretched over the line. "Oh, goodness, Madelyn. If the shoe fits." After she hung up, I sat completely motionless in the quiet kitchen. I wasn't furious anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I was just so tired, deeply, irrevocably tired of playing a game where the rules were rigged against me from the start. Garrison came home an hour later, radiating the high-energy buzz of a man who had just closed a lucrative trading deal. When I calmly told him about his mother's phone call, he didn't even look up from his tablet. He just rubbed his temples with a practiced sigh. "You know how she is, Maddie. She's stressed. The entire reputation of Vance Nexus Wealth is on display this weekend. Just wear whatever dress she wants and let it go. There it was again. The ultimate Vance defense mechanism. The shield. The universal permission slip for cruelty. You know how she is. It was the phrase that demanded I sacrifice my dignity to protect their comfortable status quo. The night of the gala arrived on a crisp, clear Saturday in late October. The venue was a magnificent historic art museum in Upper Manhattan that Harrison had heavily funded for decades. Massive glass tents covered the outdoor courtyard, heated perfectly against the autumn chill. Thousands of white orchids lined the grand marble staircase, and string lights hung like frozen stars from the old trees. Elite caterers in custom tuxedos moved flawlessly through the sea of wealth, carrying silver trays of vintage champagne and caviar. On the surface, it was a flawless exhibition of American aristocracy. Harrison shook hands with foreign dignitaries, accepting breathless congratulations on his multi-billion-dollar empire. Eleanor greeted guests like royalty receiving loyal subjects, her diamonds catching the light of 100 camera flashes. Garrison mingled effortlessly with the senior partners, radiating the confidence of a legacy heir, and I followed 4-year-old Oliver around the edge of the grand ballroom, making sure he didn't accidentally trip over a priceless sculpture or wander into the VIP press lounge. For the first hour, I managed to blend into the background a functional ghost in a designer dress I hated. Then Eleanor found me. I was sitting at a small, secluded table near the glass wall overlooking the illuminated Hudson River, helping Oliver wipe a stray smudge of chocolate icing from his fingers. That was when I heard the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels on the marble floor. I looked up. Eleanor was approaching her silk gown, billowing elegantly behind her. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne flanked by 3 of her elite socialite friends, including Victoria Sterling, the matriarch of another prominent New York financial dynasty. I should have recognized the calculated glint in her eyes. It was the look of a predator who had spotted an easy target in an open field. She was hunting. Madelyn Eleanor announced loudly, her voice carrying over the chamber music and catching the attention of several nearby investors. "There you are. I was just telling Victoria about your fascinating little arrangement. I heard you are still insisting on working from home for that. What was it? That little science startup?" I stood up slowly, smoothing down the fabric of my dress, forcing myself to smile politely, despite the sudden spike of adrenaline in my veins. "It's a global biotechnology firm, Eleanor. And yes, my position allows me to work remotely, which let me stay close to Oliver." "Oh yes, must be nice," Eleanor said, turning to her friends with a theatrical, patronizing sigh. "It's a job, of course, though. I suppose some people are fortunate enough not to need real impactful careers. It's so sweet how you keep yourself occupied with data entry while Garrison handles the actual weight of the fund." A few of the surrounding guests chuckled nervously, exchanging uncomfortable glances. I felt a fierce, burning heat rise directly into my face. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I instinctively glanced across the crowded ballroom, searching for my husband. Garrison was standing 20 feet away, locked in conversation with a senior compliance officer. He heard his mother's voice. He turned his head and looked directly at us. He saw the predatory circle surrounding his wife. He saw the humiliation burning in my eyes. Then deliberately, he unbuttoned his suit jacket, turned his back to me, and walked deeper into the crowd. In that exact microsecond, something inside me cracked. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive snap. It was a quiet, profound tearing, the sound of a heavy rope finally giving way after 8 years of unbearable silent strain. The illusion of my marriage didn't just break, it evaporated. Eleanor wasn't done. Sensing her complete dominance, she took a sip of her champagne and looked down her nose at me. "You know Madelyn, when Garrison was younger, we always imagined he'd marry someone with a little more natural ambition, someone who understood the societal obligations of the Vance name. But I suppose we can't all inherit pedigree." The conversation in our immediate quadrant of the ballroom died instantly. People stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped pretending to be distracted. The ambient noise of the gala seemed to fade into a muffled roar. For the first time in 8 years, nobody was looking away from the abuse. Everyone was watching. And for the first time in 8 years, I decided I was completely done protecting their comfort. I stood at my full height, looking directly into Eleanor Vance's cold, pristine face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream, but I spoke with a terrifying, crystal-clear precision that carried to every single person standing in that wing of the museum. "Let's stop pretending, Eleanor," I said, gently taking the linen napkin from Oliver's hand and setting it on the table. The courtyard went completely dead. Somewhere in the distance, a camera shutter clicked. A server walked past his tray, vibrating slightly, but around our table the silence settled like a heavy, suffocating wool blanket. Eleanor blinked, her perfect composure faltering for a fraction of a second. "I beg your pardon." "No, you don't," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of the fear that had dictated my life for a decade. "You aren't begging for anything, and you certainly aren't sorry." Several of the hedge fund partners shifted uncomfortably on their feet. Within seconds, I saw Garrison breaking away from his group, practically sprinting toward us through the crowd. I could see the raw panic etched into his features. But it wasn't panic for me. It was panic for the situation. He was terrified that things were about to become awkward in front of the press. But I was entirely done protecting the Vance family from the consequences of their own cruelty. For 8 years, I had swallowed every microaggression, every backhanded compliment, every public and private reminder that I was considered an inferior outsider. I had smiled through high society holidays, elite birthdays, and suffocating family dinners. And where had that gotten me? It had gotten me a 4-year-old son who was already learning to view his own mother through the lens of their toxic classism. I looked back at Eleanor, whose face was beginning to freeze into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. "You've spent 8 years treating me like a charity case you were forced to tolerate," I said clearly, ensuring the nearby journalists could hear every syllable. "You criticize my education, my career, my family, and my parenting. You do it so constantly under the guise of polite concern that I don't even think your ego realizes you're doing it anymore." "Madelyn, enough!" Garrison hissed, finally slamming into the circle and grabbing my upper arm with a grip that was far too tight. "No!" I said, twisting my arm out of his grasp and turning to face him directly. "Not this time, Garrison." The look on my husband's face didn't surprise me. He wasn't furious because his mother had insulted me. He was mortified because I was airing our reality in public. He was embarrassed that people might actually see the rot behind the pristine Vance curtain. He was never embarrassed by the psychological abuse I suffered. He was only embarrassed that we were finally openly discussing it. Eleanor crossed her glittering arms, her voice turning into pure ice. "If you've been harboring this pathetic middle-class resentment all these years, Madelyn, that is hardly my fault." A few of the older board members nodded in agreement. Of course they did. This entire room was built on protecting the narrative, protecting the capital, and protecting appearances at all costs. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a sudden, powerful wave of clarity wash over me. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Eleanor." Eleanor let out a sharp, bitter laugh, looking at the crowd. "Oh, I am certain you are about to tell all of us. When someone hurts me, I actually have the humanity to feel it," I said softly. "But when you hurt people, you've spent so long wrapped in your own privilege that you actually convince yourself you're doing them a favor." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even Harrison Vance, the Grand Patriarch, stood frozen 5 feet away, his glass of champagne trembling slightly in his hand. The empire of Vance Nexus Wealth had just been publicly challenged, and the war had officially crossed international lines. "This is not the time or the place, Madelyn," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped her champagne flute so tightly I thought the crystal would shatter. I almost laughed. It was the exact phrase I had heard for nearly a decade. Not now, not here, not today, not during dinner, not during Christmas, not during Thanksgiving. There was never a proper time or a right place to voice my pain because the objective was never to resolve the conflict. The objective was to keep me quiet, to preserve the flawless veneer of the Vance dynasty while they slowly ground my identity into dust. Garrison stepped directly between us, his body rigid, blocking my view of his mother. "Madelyn, I said enough," he commanded, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. I looked at him. Really looked at him. This was the man I had stood across from at an altar in Oregon, the man who had promised before God and our friends that I would never have to face the hardships of this world alone. This was the man who had spent the last 8 years standing beside me physically while completely abandoning me emotionally. "Enough," I asked softly, my voice contrasting sharply with his escalating aggression. "Yes, enough of what Garrison, this..." I gestured toward the frozen crowd, the journalists holding their recording devices, the stunned socialites. "The scene you think I'm creating? Yes, the scene," he hissed, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. "Look around you. You are humiliating my family on the most important night of my father's career." The scene, not the systematic humiliation I had endured, not the years of cold isolation, just the fact that the ghost had finally decided to speak. In that moment, a profound, painful clarity settled deep into my bones. It was like finally admitting a terrifying truth you had spent a lifetime running away from. Garrison wasn't a neutral party trying to keep the peace. He never had been. Neutral people don't repeatedly choose one side under the guise of diplomacy. They choose silence, and in a dynamic of abuse, silence always benefits the oppressor, never the person being crushed. Eleanor let out a delicate, practiced sigh of relief, stepping back into the protective circle of her street wall peers. She honestly believed she had won. She believed Garrison would successfully restore the social order, put the middle-class girl back in her place, and bury the scandal before the dessert course was served. Then, my husband delivered the exact sentence that ended our marriage. "Kneel down and apologize to my mother!" Garrison snapped, his voice sharpening to a lethal edge. The words hit my chest harder than I ever could have anticipated. I stared at him, completely unblinking. "What did you just say to me?" "You heard me." He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me, his eyes dark with a furious, erratic energy. "You are going to apologize to my mother right now in front of everyone. You embarrassed my family." I couldn't believe the absolute absurdity of what I was hearing. A short, broken laugh escaped my lips. "Your family. That's all that ever mattered, isn't it? The Vance name. The Vance portfolio." Garrison's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He leaned in, his breath hot against my cheek. "You have two choices, Madelyn, and I want you to listen to me very carefully. Apologize right now, or you can pack your bags and leave my house tonight." Yeah. The historic museum courtyard became so silent I could hear the autumn leaves scraping against the glass tents outside. Nobody spoke up for me. Nobody objected to his cruelty. None of his cousins, none of the board members, none of the people who had eaten dinner at my table said Garrison had gone too far. Eleanor looked deeply satisfied, a small, triumphant smirk playing at the corner of her lips. Harrison Vance looked down at his bespoke leather shoes, refusing to meet my gaze, and suddenly I understood everything. They were all waiting for me to fold. They expected me to burst into tears, to drop to my knees, to apologize for my outburst, and to choose their comfort over my own dignity one more time. They thought my financial dependence on Garrison made me weak. I looked down at Oliver. My beautiful, innocent little boy was standing by the edge of the velvet-draped table, clutching his linen napkin. He was confused, frightened, and watching everything. He was learning the exact same way children always learn from the silent choices of their parents. And I knew with absolute certainty what lesson I would teach him if I apologized in that moment. I would teach him that it is acceptable for powerful people to humiliate the person you love. I would teach him that your spouse can abandon you when things get difficult. I would teach him that standing up for your own humanity is a crime. I refused to teach my son that lesson. Not anymore. Without uttering another syllable to my husband or his mother, I reached down and picked Oliver up, holding his small body tightly against my chest. "Madelyn, don't you dare walk away from me!" Garrison shouted after me as I turned on my heel. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Behind me I could hear the roar of voices rising instantly, arguments, confusion, Eleanor trying to manage the press, Garrison barking orders to his assistant. But for the first time in 8 years, none of it mattered. The glass cage had shattered, and I was finally walking through the debris. The drive back to the Upper East Side penthouse was the most peaceful 30 minutes of my entire adult life. The New York skyline blurred past the taxi window, the bright yellow cabs and neon billboards flashing in the autumn night. Oliver eventually fell asleep in my arms, his small, warm face looking completely calm, safe and trusting. He had absolutely no idea that our lives were shifting on their axis, that the trajectory of his entire future had changed in the span of a single conversation. When we reached the penthouse, I carried him upstairs to his bedroom. I tucked him into his bed, smoothed his hair, and kissed his forehead. "I love you, buddy," I whispered. "Mommy's got you." Then I sat down alone at the massive marble island in the kitchen. The penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. Garrison hadn't come home yet. He was undoubtedly still at the museum, drinking expensive scotch and attempting to spin the narrative with the public relations team. My phone was vibrating violently on the counter, sliding inches across the stone surface. Dozens of text messages were flooding in. Messages from Garrison's cousins, messages from board members' wives, messages asking what was wrong with me, telling me I had completely ruined Harrison's legacy and advising me to smooth things over before the morning stock market opened. Not a single message asked if I was okay. Not one person checked to see if I was safe. It was a fascinating, cold confirmation of everything I had felt for 8 years. I wasn't a human being to them. I was an asset that had suddenly gone rogue. At exactly 11 p.m., the heavy front door clicked open. Garrison walked in. He had taken off his tie, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were a volatile mix of exhaustion and unyielding anger. He dropped his platinum keys onto the counter with a loud, echoey clang. Neither of us spoke for several agonizing seconds. The tension in the room was thick enough to breathe. "Well," Garrison finally said, stepping into the kitchen light. I looked up from my laptop, my expression completely flat. "Well, what, Garrison? Are you going to apologize?" There wasn't a single shred of sadness or regret in his voice. There was only pure expectation, as though this was just a minor corporate disagreement, as though I merely needed to correct my erratic behavior and fall back into line. I stared at the man I had loved for nearly a decade, the man I had built a life with, and I realized with a sudden jolt that I didn't recognize him anymore. Or perhaps more accurately, I was finally seeing him with perfect, unclouded vision. "No," I said clearly. The single word hung heavily in the air between us. Garrison blinked, genuinely stunned. "What do you mean, no? I am never apologizing to your mother, and I am never apologizing to you," I said, my voice rising with a quiet, undeniable authority. His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Then I guess you've made your choice, Madelyn. You made your bed. Now you can sleep in it." I nodded slowly, a calm smile touching my lips. "Yeah, I did." I stood up from the stool. Garrison seemed surprised by my lack of emotion. He was likely expecting tears, begging, or a frantic negotiation for my allowance. Instead, I walked right past him without making eye contact and went straight up the stairs. I dragged my 2 largest suitcases out of the closet. I didn't touch the designer gowns Eleanor had bought me. I didn't touch the expensive diamond earrings Garrison had given me to compensate for his absences. I packed the practical things, the important things. I packed my clothes, Oliver's clothes, his favorite stuffed dinosaur, his pediatric medications, his favorite storybooks, and his worn-out baby blanket. Around midnight, I sat at the small desk in the corner of our room and opened my laptop. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time, my heart thumping hard against my ribs. Then, with a definitive click of the trackpad, I purchased 2 one-way business-class tickets from JFK to London Heathrow. One for me, one for Oliver. The confirmation email arrived seconds later, illuminating my face in the dark room. I sat there looking at the digital barcode, my hands trembling violently. Not because I was afraid of the unknown, but because for the very first time in my life, I was completely, beautifully free. The next morning, Garrison left the penthouse incredibly early, before the sun had even cleared the East River. He didn't say goodbye to me or Oliver. He assumed I would eventually give in. He assumed the reality of New York rent and the sheer terror of being alone would force me to crawl back to his mother's brownstone to beg for forgiveness. He assumed I had nowhere else to go. 3 days later, after quietly finalizing my remote work transit, with my biotech firm, Oliver and I boarded a massive Boeing 777. As the flight attendant secured the cabin doors, I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and switched it to airplane mode. An hour later, as the plane climbed through the gray New York clouds and the endless deep blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean stretched out beneath us, a sudden wave of relief washed over me. For the first time in 8 long years, nobody was standing over my shoulder telling me to stay quiet. The first few weeks in London felt less like a grand, liberating fresh start, and more like a state of meticulously controlled chaos. High society romance novels love to romanticize the concept of leaving everything behind. They paint a picture of dramatic airport embraces, instant emotional freedom, and some magical, instantaneous transformation waiting for you on the other side of the Atlantic. The raw reality of a transatlantic escape was vastly less glamorous. I spent my damp gray London mornings drowning in endless immigration paperwork, trying to secure a long-term flat lease without a British credit history. My afternoons were consumed by trying to navigate an entirely unfamiliar transit system while dragging a stroller through the underground. My exhausting evenings were spent trying to comfort a confused 4-year-old boy who was struggling to adjust to a life and accent and a climate he hadn't chosen. Some nights after Oliver finally cried himself to sleep in our cramped, furnished temporary apartment in Chelsea, I would sit alone on the threadbare sofa, staring at the rain lashing against the window pane, and genuinely wonder if I had completely lost my mind. Not because I regretted leaving Garrison. I never for a single second regretted leaving that toxic penthouse. I only deeply regretted waiting 8 years to do it. Still, there were moments when the crushing weight of reality hit me like a physical blow. I was alone, truly terrifyingly alone. I had no nearby relatives to lean on, no childhood friends to call for an emergency babysitter, and absolutely no financial safety net outside of my own resourcefulness. It was just me and a little boy who depended on me for his entire universe. Fortunately, my remote position as a senior data analyst for the Oregon-based biotech firm was my saving grace. The 5-hour time difference made my schedule incredibly complicated, often forcing me to log into secure servers and analyze massive genetic data streams late into the night while London slept, but it allowed me to maintain a steady, independent American dollar income while I rebuilt our shattered lives from scratch. During the day, Oliver attended a small, charming nursery school just a few blocks from our flat. The staff there were kind, patient, and wrapped in a genuine, unforced warmth that felt entirely foreign to me. For the first time in nearly a decade, I wasn't constantly bracing myself for a biting critique. Nobody at the nursery school questioned my parenting philosophies. Nobody made snide comments about my casual clothes or my lack of a trust fund. Nobody compared my son to a peer with a better pedigree. The sheer peace of the environment felt incredibly unfamiliar, like a language I had forgotten how to speak. Then, just as I was beginning to find my footing, life brutally reminded me that peace and safety are not always the same thing. About 6 weeks after our stealthy arrival in England, Oliver woke up shivering. At first, it seemed like an ordinary preschool cold, a mild runny nose, a congested cough, the typical bugs children trade in autumn. Nothing unusually alarming. But by the second afternoon, a vicious, burning fever arrived. By the third night, his skin felt like a furnace. He could barely keep his heavy eyelids open, and his breathing had turned into a terrifying shallow wheeze that rattled deep within his chest. Any parent knows that exact, paralyzing feeling, that horrific split second when your ancestral instincts begin screaming at the top of their lungs before your rational brain can even process the data. I didn't wait for a morning appointment. I threw a heavy coat over his pajamas, scooped his limp, burning body into my arms, and rushed out into the freezing London downpour to hail a black cab to the nearest central hospital. The emergency department was an absolute war zone of human misery. Children were crying, erratic heart monitors beeped relentlessly in the background, and exhausted nurses moved with frantic, calculated speed through the overcrowded, brightly lit hallways. I sat on a hard plastic chair, crushing Oliver against my chest, while a toxic cocktail of maternal fear and exhaustion twisted itself into agonizing knots inside my stomach. Several agonizing hours later, a senior physician finally entered our small assessment curtain. He appeared to be in his early 60s, tall with a thick mane of silver hair and an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. He was the rare kind of doctor who somehow lowered your soaring anxiety simply by walking into the room and speaking. He offered a warm smile, extended a hand, and introduced himself in a deep, reassuring British accent. "Hello, I'm Dr. Nicholas Vance. Let's take a proper look at this brave little man, shall we?" At the time, the surname Vance meant absolutely nothing to me. It was a common enough name, and my brain was too hyper-focused on my son's labored breathing to play detective. I just nodded numbly, desperate for help. Dr. Nicholas Vance examined Oliver with an extraordinary level of care. He listened intently to his congested lungs, checked his oxygen saturation, asked a series of highly detailed medical questions, and immediately ordered a round of chest x-rays and intravenous antibiotics. Later that night, after the terrifying rush of the admission had slowed, he returned to our private cubicle with the digital results. "It's acute bronchopneumonia," Dr. Nicholas said, his voice dropping to a gentle, steady tone. The medical diagnosis hit me like a physical punch to the solar plexus. I felt all the oxygen drain from my body, and I instinctively buried my face in my hands. Dr. Nicholas immediately noticed my silent collapse. He pulled up a rolling stool, sat down directly in front of me, and placed a comforting fatherly hand on my trembling shoulder. "Look at me, Madelyn," he said softly but firmly. "It is entirely treatable. You brought him in early, and that is what matters most. He is on the right medication now. I promise you we are going to get your boy through this." Tears finally spilled over my eyelashes. For 20 minutes, this brilliant, busy chief of pediatric surgery sat with an absolute stranger, explaining the entire treatment protocol in plain, accessible language. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't checking his watch, and he wasn't looking past me to the next file. He was just treating me like a human being who desperately needed empathy. Oliver remained hospitalized for 6 long days. During that grueling week, Dr. Nicholas stopped by our room constantly, far more frequently than was medically necessary for a senior consultant, if I was being completely honest. At first, I assumed it was just a coincidence of his shift rotation. Then I realized it was deliberate. Even on the days when he wasn't directly assigned to Oliver's ward, his silver head would pop through the door. He would bring Oliver small, illustrated books about London, tell corny jokes to make him smile, and check to ensure I was actually eating the meals the nurses brought. One sunny afternoon, a recovering Oliver proudly showed the doctor a colorful crayon drawing he had been working on. Nicholas studied the messy paper as though it were a masterpiece destined for a grand museum. "This is remarkable work, Oliver," Nicholas beamed, pointing to a tall, silver-haired figure in the crayon drawing. "That's you, Dr. Nick." Oliver cheered, his energy finally returning. "And that's my mommy standing next to you." Nicholas smiled, a gentle, wistful look softening his eyes. "Then I am incredibly honored to be included in your art." An effortless, beautiful bond had formed between them. On the morning of our official discharge, Nicholas surprised us by handing Oliver a beautifully crafted small stuffed fox. "To ensure a full recovery," Nicholas whispered with a wink, "every great explorer needs a proper traveling companion through London." I thanked him profusely, my voice thick with emotion. Nicholas simply shrugged his broad shoulders. "It was my absolute pleasure, Madelyn. Take care of yourselves." After that, I realistically assumed we would never see the brilliant doctor again. I was wrong. A week later, I ran into him at a small independent coffee shop near Oliver's nursery. A few days after that, we crossed paths at a community library event, and then again outside a historic bookstore in Chelsea. London was a massive metropolis, but our specific neighborhood was surprisingly insular. Eventually, after the third accidental encounter, Nicholas laughed heartily and suggested that perhaps fate was getting impatient with us. Over the next month, an unexpected, deeply comforting friendship blossomed between us. Nicholas lived entirely alone in a magnificent multi-story historic red brick townhouse overlooking a quiet square in Chelsea. He had never married, had no children of his own, and spent his rare days off tending to a small garden. There was a quiet, permanent air of melancholy about him. Not bitterness, not anger, but a deep-seated, settled grief that seemed to anchor his entire personality. One rainy Sunday afternoon, he kindly invited Oliver and me over to his townhouse for a proper British afternoon tea. The interior of his home was breathtaking, filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, rich mahogany furniture, and a roaring fireplace. The sheer warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the freezing, miserable downpour outside. For an hour, everything felt blissfully peaceful. Oliver was happily playing with a collection of antique toy boats that Nicholas kept in a woven basket by the hearth. I stood up to find the ground-floor guest bathroom, walking down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with framed historical medical diplomas and personal photographs. I stopped dead in my tracks. My stomach violently constricted into a tight, sickening knot. There was a large framed black-and-white photograph hanging directly in the center of the wall. The faces in the picture were younger, perhaps 30 years younger, but they were unmistakably familiar. Standing proudly in front of the New York Stock Exchange was a young, vibrant Dr. Nicholas. And standing right beside him with his arm slung arrogantly over Nicholas's shoulder was my billionaire father-in-law, Harrison Vance. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat, my eyes frantically scanning the other faces in the background. There were aunts, cousins, and older board members whose lavish parties I had been forced to attend in the Hamptons. What on earth were the architects of my personal nightmare doing on a wall in a quiet townhouse in London? I heard the soft click of leather shoes behind me on the hardwood floor. I turned around. Dr. Nicholas was standing at the entrance of the hallway holding a fresh pot of tea. The moment his eyes met mine and he saw exactly which photograph I was staring at, his entire facial expression shifted. There was no panic, no anger, only a profound, heavy resignation, the look of a man who knew a long-delayed, painful conversation had finally caught up with him. For several agonizing seconds, neither of us breathed. The crackle of the fireplace from the living room felt miles away. I lifted a trembling finger and pointed directly at the glass frame. "Why is Harrison Vance in this picture, Nicholas?" Nicholas looked at the photograph quietly, his eyes filled with a lifetime of sorrow. Then he slowly closed his eyes and let out a long, tired sigh that seemed to echo through the empty hallway. When he finally opened them, his voice was softer, carrying a devastating weight. "Because that is my family too, Madelyn." For a terrifying, disorienting moment, I honestly believed I had completely misunderstood him. Perhaps the subtle differences in our accents had distorted the words. Perhaps my mind, still deeply traumatized by the emotional warfare of Manhattan, was projecting my worst nightmares onto this kind, gentle physician. I looked from Nicholas's sorrowful face back to the black and white photograph, my chest heaving as my brain scrambled to compute the impossible data. "What do you mean, your family?" I whispered, my voice echoing hollowly down the narrow hallway. "Harrison Vance is a ruthless Wall Street tycoon. He owns Vance Nexus Wealth. He has lived in New York his entire life." Nicholas set the porcelain teapot down on a small console table with a soft, deliberate click. He folded his broad arms across his chest, staring at the frame with a look of bone-deep exhaustion. "He does own it now, Madelyn. But he wasn't always the sole heir. Come into the kitchen. Sit down. I think it's time we both stop keeping secrets." A few minutes later, we were sitting across from one another at a rustic oak table. Steam rose lazily from 2 untouched mugs of Earl Grey tea drifting into the quiet air. In the next room, the muffled, joyful sounds of Oliver crashing his antique toy boats into imaginary harbor walls provided a bizarre grounding soundtrack to a moment that felt entirely surreal. Nicholas stared out the rain-streaked window for what felt like an eternity, gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, carrying the weight of an ancient verdict. "Harrison Vance is my half-brother. We share the same father, the original founder of what used to be a modest boutique investment firm in the late 1980s. My heart skipped a violent beat. "Your half-brother Garrison never mentioned an uncle?" "Not once. In 8 years of marriage, his name was never spoken at a single family gathering." "Of course it wasn't." Nicholas said, a faint, deeply bitter smile touching his lips. "Because to the Vance dynasty I don't exist. I am a ghost they spent 3 decades systematically erasing from the ledger of their public history. Our father married my mother first. After she tragically passed away from illness when I was a teenager, he eventually remarried, and Harrison was born 5 years later. Despite the age gap, when we were young men, we were close, incredibly close." Nicholas stood up, walked over to a built-in bookcase, and retrieved an old leather-bound photo album. He laid it open on the table between us. Together, we flipped through the faded, glossy pages. I saw young men fishing on pristine lakes, family picnics in upstate New York Ivy League graduations, and snowy Christmas mornings in Connecticut. There was a younger, less hardened Harrison. And standing right beside him, shoulder to shoulder, in almost every single shot, was Nicholas. They looked like real brothers, vibrant, laughing, completely unaware of the wreckage waiting for them in the future. "What happened?" I asked quietly, my eyes tracing the youthful lines of my father-in-law's face. "The absolute ruin of all wealthy families," Nicholas replied, closing the album with a heavy thud. "Money, corporate greed, and the terrifying lengths an older brother will go to secure total dominance." After I completed my initial university degrees, I joined the family firm. I worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificed my youth, and helped expand our portfolio. Our father openly planned for both of us to share co-leadership of the firm when he retired. But then our father suffered a massive, debilitating stroke. Suddenly, the question of absolute control became urgent and dangerous. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, his broad shoulders tensing under his wool sweater. Within 3 months of my father being incapacitated, the compliance department launched a sudden, aggressive internal investigation. The accusation against me was catastrophic: massive financial misconduct, insider trading, and the systematic embezzlement of $40 million from our most high-profile sovereign wealth fund. I frowned, my data analyst brain immediately analyzing the scenario. $40 million. That's a corporate death sentence. Did you do it? Nicholas laughed, a dry, hollow sound that had no joy in it. No, Madelyn. I was naive. I believed in the absolute power of facts, evidence, and data. I assumed it was a massive accounting error that would easily be sorted out by our legal team. What I didn't realize was that the legal team had already been bought and paid for by Harrison. He had spent a year meticulously engineering the entire trap. He forged my digital signatures on shell company wires, altered encrypted internal records, and planted incriminating trading logs on my personal office server. He leaned forward, his icy blue eyes the exact shade of my husband's locking onto mine. The pressure was monstrous. Whispers among employees' friends, suddenly refusing to return my calls, federal investigators circling my apartment. Harrison came to me privately, playing the part of the grieving, supportive brother. He told me the board was furious. He said if I fought the charges publicly, the scandal would destroy the firm's credit rating, bankrupt the family, and send me to a federal penitentiary for 20 years. A sudden chilling realization hit me. He offered you an escape route, a golden muzzle. Nicholas nodded slowly. He presented me with a set of ironclad, confidential legal documents. If I signed over my entire inheritance, relinquished all my corporate ownership rights, and left the United States permanently, the firm would quietly cover the missing funds, drop the internal investigation, and ensure the SEC never received the forged files. I was exhausted, isolated, and completely broken. Nobody in that family, none of the cousins, none of the aunts, not even Harrison's new bride, Eleanor, was willing to stand up and say that something was deeply wrong with the narrative. So I signed. I walked away into total exile. The sheer similarity of their tactics hit my chest like a physical blow. The Vance family didn't resolve internal conflict. They completely erased the human beings who threatened their carefully curated matrix of power. Whether it was a co-heir to a multi-billion-dollar fund or a middle-class wife from Oregon who dared to demand basic human dignity, the mechanism was exactly the same: isolate, terrify, crush, and erase. Did Harrison know he was destroying an innocent man? I whispered. Harrison engineered the blade, Madelyn, Nicholas said softly. He knew exactly what he was doing. And that is the true rot at the center of the Vance wealth. I packed my life into 3 suitcases, moved across the ocean, changed my career trajectory entirely, and dedicated myself to medicine. Nicholas continued, his voice regaining its professional, measured calm. I built a life here in London, a good life, a quiet life. But beneath the surface, you never truly outrun the ghost of a stolen identity. He stood up, walked to a small secure keypad on the wall, and opened a concealed cabinet door. Inside were several large, heavy-duty, fireproof storage boxes, neatly labeled and preserved with military precision. He carried them over, stacking them heavily onto the oak kitchen table, right next to our cold tea. I stared at the sheer volume of paper. What is all this? This is 30 years of silent counterforensics, Nicholas said, opening the first box to reveal thousands of pages of encrypted financial records, original bank routing numbers, handwritten memos from deceased executives, and legacy server backups he had secretly downloaded before his security access was revoked in 1996. I didn't keep these for revenge. Revenge requires an emotional investment I refuse to give to Harrison Vance. I kept them because the data doesn't lie. Because despite their billions, the absolute truth still matters. As a senior data analyst, my eyes practically watering at the sight of organized raw data, I pulled the first thick folder toward me. Within 10 minutes of scanning the historical transaction logs, the sophisticated pattern of the fraud became blindingly obvious. The wire transfer dates didn't match the Federal Clearinghouse timelines. The digital authorization keys belonged to an administrator terminal that only Harrison had access to. The signatures on the offshore shell accounts were sloppy, hurried imitations of Nicholas's handwriting. This isn't just an internal family dispute, I muttered, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I flipped through the damning pages. Nicholas, if these original server backups are verified against current SEC regulations, this constitutes active ongoing wire fraud and a 30-year corporate conspiracy. The entire foundation of Vance Nexus Wealth is built on a massive, illegal lie. Yes, Nicholas said quietly, watching my face. It is. At that exact high-stakes microsecond, the sudden aggressive vibration of my phone on the wooden table startled both of us. The noise was incredibly loud in the quiet kitchen. I glanced down at the glowing screen. Garrison. It was the very first direct cellular call I had received from my husband in nearly 3 months of total radio silence. I stared at his name, my breath catching in my throat. Nicholas gave me a calm, encouraging nod. My fingers trembled slightly as I slid the green icon across the glass and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello, Garrison," I said, my voice completely devoid of the fear that used to define our marriage. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched over the transatlantic line. For a second, I thought the international connection had completely failed. Then I heard the sound of a ragged, heavy intake of breath. When Garrison finally spoke, his voice sounded stripped of its usual corporate arrogance. He sounded older, frayed, and deeply stressed. "Madelyn," he said, his tone tight. "I've been trying to reach your remote office loop for weeks. Your HR department refused to give me your physical coordinates." I know I replied flatly, tracing my finger over a forged 1995 wire transfer document, "because I instructed them not to." "Why are you calling me Garrison? We need to handle this situation immediately." He commanded, a flash of his old, authoritative self breaking through the fatigue. "The family legal team has already drafted the initial custody and separation petitions in the New York family court system. You can't just keep my son in an undisclosed location. You are going to bring Oliver back to Manhattan on a flight this week. Or we will involve federal law enforcement for international parental abduction. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" He was still trying to use the old script. He was still trying to terrify the middle-class girl from Oregon into total submission by waving their immense wealth and legal power in her face. He wanted control of the information control of the child and control of my life. I looked across the table at Nicholas. I looked at the mountain of fireproof boxes, the decades of hidden truth, and the brilliant, honorable man they had tried to erase from existence. A sudden, powerful wave of absolute fearlessness washed over me. I made my decision. "If you want to serve those custody papers, Garrison, you are welcome to try," I said, my voice dropping to a slow, lethal whisper. "But you won't find me at a hotel, and you won't find me hiding. I am currently sitting at a kitchen table in Chelsea having afternoon tea with Dr. Nicholas Vance. Total, absolute vacuum silence. No response, no breathing, no movement on the other end of the line. It was as if the entire island of Manhattan had suddenly dropped into the ocean. For 10 full seconds, the line was completely dead. When Garrison finally spoke again, the corporate armor was entirely gone. The threats of legal action vanished. His voice dropped to a terrified, erratic whisper that trembled with a raw, primal fear I had never heard from a Vance in my entire life. "What? What did you just say to me, Madelyn?" I leaned over the table, looking directly into the blue eyes of his exiled uncle, and repeated the words with absolute terrifying clarity. "I said, I am with Nicholas Vance. And Garrison, we are currently looking through his corporate archives." This time the silence lasted even longer. Somewhere 3,000 miles away, in a glass skyscraper on Wall Street, the ultimate panic had just officially begun. The silence stretching across the Atlantic Ocean was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a physical weight. On my end of the line, in that quiet, sun-drenched kitchen in Chelsea, the only noise was the distant, comforting clatter of Oliver's antique toy boats in the living room. On Garrison's end, 3,000 miles away in Manhattan, I could practically hear the high-altitude gears of street wall grinding to a catastrophic halt. When my husband finally managed to speak, the voice that came through the speaker didn't belong to the confident senior partner of Vance Nexus Wealth. It belonged to a terrified boy watching his inheritance evaporate in real time. "Madelyn, this isn't funny," Garrison stammered, his breath catching sharply in his throat. "Nicholas is dead. He died in a sailing accident in the Mediterranean 25 years ago. My father handled the memorial service. What kind of twisted, sick game are you playing?" I looked across the table at Nicholas. The silver-haired doctor didn't blink. He simply reached out, his large surgeon's hand steady and calm, and gently tapped the speakerphone icon on my screen. He handled a memorial service for a ghost he manufactured, Garrison. Nicholas said, his deep, resonant British accent cutting through the transatlantic static like a scalpel. But as you can hear, the dead have a rather inconvenient habit of refusing to stay buried. A sharp, violent intake of breath echoed from the phone. I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy crystal tumbler slamming onto a mahogany desk. Garrison was standing up. I could picture him perfectly pacing the length of his corner office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, his hands trembling as he realized the foundation beneath his feet was turning to sand. "Uncle Nicholas," Garrison whispered the word, sounding foreign, heavy, and forbidden on his tongue. No, this is impossible. The legal settlements, the non-disclosure agreements." The non-disclosure agreements were signed under extreme duress based on forged digital evidence engineered by your father. Nicholas replied, his voice completely devoid of anger, carrying only the absolute, unshakable authority of a man who had spent 30 years relying on scientific facts rather than corporate illusions. And as my brilliant friend Madelyn has just discovered, those original server backups from 1996 were never fully erased. Your father was an exceptional manipulator, Garrison, but he was a terrible data architect. Didi mamasa samao tastes. "Maddie, listen to me," Garrison pleaded, shifting his focus back to me, his tone frantic, erratic, and stripping away every ounce of the legal arrogance he had displayed just moments before. "Do not do anything reckless. Do not talk to the press. Do not look at those files anymore. You don't understand what you're dealing with. If this information gets out, if the board sees even a whisper of this, the SEC will freeze every single asset associated with Vance Nexus Wealth within 48 hours. The fund will collapse. Our entire life. Oliver's future. It will all be gone." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the oak table, looking at the mountain of fireproof boxes that contained 30 years of buried truth. "Our life, Garrison?" I asked softly, a cold, clear smile touching my lips. "We haven't had a life together for 8 years. I had a prison sentence, and you had a pristine social calendar. And don't you dare use my son's future as a human shield for your family's crimes. Oliver's future isn't tied to a multi-billion-dollar lie. His future is tied to me, eh?" "Maddie, please!" Garrison groaned, and for the first time in my life I heard a Vance beg. "What do you want? Is it money?" "The divorce settlement. I will sign anything. I will give you the penthouse. I will give you 80% of the liquid capital. I will tell my mother to stay away from you and Oliver permanently. Just, please, put the files back in the box and come home so we can talk about this like adults." It was a fascinating, desperate exhibition of the Vance psychology. When they think you are weak, they demand you kneel and apologize. When they realize you hold the blade, they offer to buy the weapon from you at any price. They didn't know how to relate to human beings through dignity. They only understood the language of leverage. "It was never about the money, Garrison," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, lethal whisper. "That is the one thing your mother's toxic privilege never allowed either of you to understand. If I wanted your money, I would have stayed in that glass cage and smiled through your Sunday dinners. I left because I wanted my soul back, and right now, Nicholas and I are going to ensure that the truth finally gets a public hearing." "Madelyn, if you do this, my father will destroy you," Garrison warned, a flash of raw animal desperation breaking through his panic. "He has connections at the highest levels of the federal government. He will tie you up in international legal battles until you don't have a single dollar left to your name." Nicholas leaned into the microphone, his eyes flashing with a cold, protective fire. "Let him try Garrison. Harrison took my youth, my country, and my inheritance 30 years ago because I was alone and naive. But Madelyn is a senior data analyst who understands the modern global financial architecture better than your entire compliance team combined. And this time, I'm standing right beside her." Without giving my husband another syllable to reply, I reached out and tapped the red end call button. The silence returned to the kitchen, but it was no longer heavy or suffocating. It felt electrical alive with the kinetic energy of a massive storm that had just been unleashed across the Atlantic Ocean. I looked at Nicholas. The silver-haired physician was staring at the stack of documents, a profound, quiet peace settling over his weathered features. The 30-year exile wasn't over yet, but the isolation had officially ended. "Are you ready for what comes next, Madelyn?" Nicholas asked softly, turning his icy blue eyes toward me. "Because the moment we upload these legacy server logs to the federal compliance portal, Harrison Vance will know within minutes. The retaliation will be swift, and it will be brutal." I reached across the table, pulled the primary 1996 transaction ledger toward my laptop, and plugged in my secure encrypted drive. I didn't hesitate for a single microsecond. "Nicholas," I said, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my heart beating with a powerful, unyielding rhythm. I spent 8 years bracing myself for their storms in Manhattan, but they forgot one very important thing about the middle-class girl from Oregon. Nicholas smiled, leaning back. "And what is that, my dear? I don't just survive the storm anymore," I said, hitting the enter key to begin the massive data upload. "I am the one who brings it."